Now that we've talked about how natural selection operates and exactly how evolution proceeds forward, I'd like to talk a little bit about the ecological niche, which is a concept we talked about before. The niche is the functional role of a species in its community or in its ecosystem, including its environmental requirements, its activities, and its relationships. Usually it's summarized as being the job of an organism in its ecosystem. So, for example, being a apex predator is part of an organism's niche, or being a producer, like a plant, would be part of the organism's niche. But also, it includes the environmental requirements of that species, because that will tell you exactly where in the ecosystem that particular producer or that particular predator fits into the picture. Right? This is a predator that only exists in the canopies of the trees, as opposed to some other predator that only hunts in the soil of the ecosystem. Here on this slide we have Darwin's finches, and each of them has a different beak shape specially adapted to a particular kind of food. On the left we have a vegetarian tree finch, so it hunts in the trees and it only eats fruits, whereas we have just above it a large insectivorous tree finch, so again hunts in the trees, but it has a grasping bill, a grasping beak for specifically grabbing insects. Then we have a smaller insectivorous tree finch, similar type of hunting location, but it's got a smaller bill, so it probably feeds on smaller insects. We have one bird who is specialized in eating the larger insects and another one that's specialized in eating the smaller insects. Now, the reason why two organisms that have what appears to be similar types of locations where they hunt and similar types of diets would specialize in that way is to reduce competition with each other. If both of them are competing for the exact same kind of food, they're going to be stepping on each other's toes a lot, and that would bring them into direct conflict with each other. They'd probably have to spend most of their time fighting off each other to try to get to the food, and then the food would just kind of scamper away. But if one of them only concentrates on the small insects and the other one only concentrates on the large insects, they don't have to waste their time competing with each other. They can just concentrate on eating. So both of their fitness can be increased by reducing how much competition they have with each other. And that's part of this niche concept as well. By reducing the overlap in each organism's niche, the overall fitness of every species can be increased. And this is part of what drives one species or one population to become multiple species or multiple populations. Making these little differences reduces overall competition. So you can see that the next type of bird uses tools in order to get insects from out of the tree. Another one has a probing bill that's much smaller. It doesn't need to use tools, but it can also get insects from out of the bark of a tree. These finches over here are ground finches. They hunt on the ground for food instead of looking in the trees themselves. These ones over here on the right hand side, these are seed eater birds. So the ones with the largest beaks eat the largest seeds, the ones with the smallest beaks eat the small seeds. Same idea, in order to reduce the competition they have with each other. Now, not only is the kind of food that an organism eats part of their niche, part of their job in the ecosystem, but like I said, exactly where they occur in the ecosystem, the environmental requirements that they have, is also part of their niche. So just like, some of these organisms are in the tops of trees and some of them are down on the ground, some organisms occur in warm climates and others in colder climates, and they might be from closely related species, but it's the same driving factor. Having these differences reduces competition with each other, and that drives evolution to create different types of species, each one trying to fulfill a different open niche that is in an ecosystem. So if you take a look at this red-eared slider, this is Bowser. He's my terrapin, my pet turtle here. Think about all of the physical factors which restrict his environmental range, which determine which ecosystems he can live in and which ecosystems he can't live in, or even which parts of the ecosystem he can live in or can't live in. Think about what kind of temperatures he would need. He would need to live in relatively warm temperatures because he is a turtle, right? So he needs relatively warm temperatures. He can't live in like a tundra ecosystem or anything like that. He needs fresh water, so he can't have saltwater environments. He couldn't live by the beach or anything like that. Pretty neutral pH, so we can't have too much pollution in that freshwater source, turning it into like an acid type water. A moderate amount of space. He doesn't need too much space, though, in order to be able to hunt. He needs some space. He needs vegetation to be able to hide in. That makes him feel a little bit more comfortable. And like all of us, he needs a certain amount of food to be able to get by. Now, if we were to graph one of these requirements on a chart here, right? On the x-axis, we have what I'm going to call the intensity of the condition, and then on the y-axis, the performance of the species. Performance being how well the species is doing. How, like, are they able to just live in that condition, right? Because it could be, we could survive, right, as people in freezing temperatures or in brutally hot temperatures. We wouldn't be happy, though. It wouldn't be the ideal environment for us. We would do much better. We would perform much better. We'd be able to go about our work much better if we were in a much narrower temperature range, somewhere between, say, 65 to 85 degrees is usually where most people's ideal temperature range ends up being, right? So there's an ideal temperature range, which we really like, and that's true for all organisms. So somewhere in the very center of this bell graph is going to be the ideal condition for each species. But to the sides of that are going to be where they are capable of surviving. So let's use temperature as the example. Here is going to be Bowser's ideal condition in the center. He can survive over this wide of a range of temperatures. We don't really need to label the axes right now because this is just an introduction to the idea. So there's some range of temperatures in which he can survive, but he's not going to do well. He's not going to be moving around very fast. He might capture some food, but he's only going to be able to capture enough food to keep himself alive. If we bring him into temperature ranges which are closer to his ideal, though, he'll be able to do a little bit better. He'll be able to move around a little bit more easily. He'll be able to operate a little bit more efficiently. He'll probably gather enough food for himself to not only be able to survive, but maybe put on some muscle, put on a little bit of fat, maybe grow a little bit larger. So he will survive and he will grow in a condition that's closer to his ideal temperature range. And then, if we get even closer, we get reproduction, right? When organisms are really close to their ideal conditions, they're able to not only survive, not only put on mass, but also to reproduce. So this ideal temperature range, where this population can actually survive, grow, and reproduce, this is part of Bowser's niche. Just like being in the tree canopy was part of those birds' niche a moment ago. Well, since these turtles can only survive, grow, and reproduce at this temperature range, the species is only going to thrive right here. So this set of temperature conditions, that's part of their niche. They are predators that fit into the ecosystem at this temperature range. But not only temperature range, we can also do the same thing for different conditions. The amount of water that's available. He needs a pretty good amount of water and to be pretty close to that source of fresh water as well. The water has to be fairly fresh. It can't be salt water. So the salinity of the water is another thing that we can map out. And you can find the ideal range for every single abiotic condition for the species. If you'll forgive me a metaphor for a moment, if an ecosystem is like a jigsaw puzzle, then mapping out what all of an organism's ideal conditions are tells you what the shape of their particular puzzle piece looks like. And then that tells you where in the ecosystem they fit exactly. It tells you what niche they are fulfilling. And if that species were to disappear suddenly, if they were to go extinct, it tells you what the shape of the niche that they left open would be. That there's a role that is now missing in the ecosystem that needs to be fulfilled by some other species. This part can be a little bit difficult to understand without a visualization, so I'm going to see if I can draw this for you. I'm going to create a graph here that puts a species' temperature requirements on the x-axis, and then I'm going to put their requirements for water salinity, so how fresh the water is, on the y-axis. The closer it is to the bottom of the graph, the fresher the water is. The closer it is to the top, the saltier the water is. So high salinity is high salt. This square is going to represent one aspect of Bowser's niche, just the temperature and freshwater requirements. Now I'm going to introduce a second species on here, and it has similar requirements. Maybe it's another type of terrapin, another kind of turtle that I'm going to add in here. And it also eats the same kind of food that Bowser eats, so it's a competitor for food. And it has similar temperature requirements, but not exactly the same. It likes it a little bit warmer. And it has similar freshwater requirements, but it actually has a wider range. So it can go a little bit fresher and it can go a little bit saltier than Bowser can. So its niche has a slightly different shape, but you can see that there's this whole area of overlap right here. Anytime you have two niches that overlap each other in this way, you have two organisms that have similar requirements and use the same resources, you're going to have competition. Now, competition is a big topic in ecology and evolution. It is one of the main driving factors in evolution by natural selection and the changes that occur. It is ultimately bad for both species because any effort they're spending competing with each other is effort that they're not able to utilize to increase their own body mass or reproduce or any of those kind of things. It just makes it harder for both species. However, this niche overlap does mean that, say, one species went extinct, well, the other one would be able to fulfill their role in the ecosystem because they live at the same temperature, they live at the same freshwater requirements, and they eat the same kinds of food. So having competitors for each niche means that the ecosystem as a whole can be pretty resilient. So you can see how the concept of a niche is tied to the notion of functional diversity that we talked about in a much earlier video. Now, competition is the first interspecific interaction that we're going to discuss. An interspecific interaction is any interaction between multiple species. And of course, they're one of the most searched things on the internet. Any video of animals of different species interacting together gets lots and lots of views. For example, here's a cheetah and a puppy who are best friends, and when they grow up, they're still best friends. I love stuff like this on the internet. But interspecific interactions are classified according to which organisms are benefiting from the interaction in terms of their evolutionary fitness. And fitness, again, is your likelihood of reproduction. Whoever is going to have the most offspring is the most fit in that environment. So, any interaction which negatively impacts both organisms' reproductive rates is a negative interaction. Competition is a negative interaction because it wastes both organisms' time. Interactions occur when two populations in a community compete for a common resource. That's negative. There are some interactions which are positive, though. They are mutually beneficial, such as when plants and pollinators interact with each other. The insects that are pollinating the plants get nectar. The plants get reproduction services. Both of those organisms are benefiting from the interaction. The insects are getting food, the plants are getting a higher reproductive rate. Both of them are going to have more offspring than they otherwise would have. There are also interactions which are positive, negative. So, for example, predation. When one animal eats another, that is a positive negative interaction. The fitness of the predator is going to be increased because they just got some food. The fitness of the prey is going to be decreased because they were just eaten. And, well, not to get too technical, but if you've been eaten, it's very difficult to have offspring. So competition is a negative-negative interaction. The fitness of both species involved is reduced. Here we have an image of a lion who has taken down a wildebeest, and it's competing for that kill, that it just spent all of that energy, a significant amount of energy, taking down this wildebeest, and now it's competing for that resource with these hyenas that have walked onto the scene. The hyena's fitness is reduced by the fact that they have to fight against this much larger opponent, the lion, to try to get their meal. The lion's fitness is reduced because every time it tries to get something to eat, it has these hyenas show up and try to yank it away. So both of them would do better if the other one just kind of disappeared. Competition reduces the fitness of both species. Now, competition can only occur over a limiting resource. If there's lots and lots and lots of a resource available, no competition needs to occur whatsoever. Why would we compete over it? There's plenty of it. I'll just get it from somewhere else. We don't need to waste our time competing over that. Here, the reason why competition exists is because the hyenas find it much easier to get the kill by taking it from the lion, or from scavenging it when they find carcasses just kind of lying half-eaten somewhere, than very often than hunting it themselves. So they're actually making almost an economic decision about the amount of effort required versus the payoff of doing that given task. It's not a conscious economic decision, but those organisms that are evolutionarily predisposed to make the best energy investment decision are the ones that are going to have the most offspring. And therefore, the hyenas that are alive today are the inheritors of this predisposition to put forth the least effort possible to get the maximum amount of reward. There's actually lots of examples of this in the animal kingdom, where in all biology, actually, plants too, where you can find organisms have figured out the exact ideal amount of effort investment to put into a task in order to statistically get back the optimum amount of resources. So what would be a good example of a limiting resource? Remember when we talked about the biogeochemical cycles and I said that phosphorus is frequently a limiting resource in ecosystems. And what scoops up phosphorus? The plants do, right? So plants are constantly competing with each other for phosphorus. Therefore, in many ecosystems, the plants that are the most well adapted are the ones that are able to grab phosphorus from the soil the most quickly. That is the most pressing driving factor for evolutionary selection. And as we're talking about plants, another limiting resource might be sunlight, because there's only so much space for plants to grow. One of the reasons why forests grow so tall is that plants are constantly trying to get taller and taller to outcompete each other to get the maximum amount of sunlight. They're trying to cast the other plants in shadow so that they can get maximum exposure to sunlight. So trees are getting taller and taller and taller to get up to that canopy. So there's competition for a limited resource, which is sun exposure. Like I said, competition is one of the main driving factors of evolutionary selection, either because it'll drive competitors to go bigger and bigger and bigger to try to outdo each other, or it will force them to specialize on one part of a resource, like those finches did. Like, I'll only do the small seeds, you only do the big seeds, in order to avoid the competition altogether, which might be a better strategy. So let's put a few of these ideas all together. We talked about niches, we talked about niche overlap, and we talked about competition and how it's a negative interaction. So anytime you have two niches that overlap each other, you get competition. What would happen if you had perfect niche overlap? You had two organisms that had the exact same environmental requirements, the exact same food requirements, they had the exact same reproductive rates as far as you could tell. They were complete competitors. They operated exactly the same. They fulfilled the exact same role in the ecosystem. As far as you could tell, they had the same niche. They were total competitors. What would happen if you put them into a chamber together and you gave them a limited resource? Would they both die? Would they find some sort of balance, some sort of 50-50 balance between each other, locked in a constant tug of war? Would one be driven to extinction and the other grow to dominate? What would eventually happen in a situation where you had two complete competitors and a limited number of resources? That's what G.F. Gauss wanted to find out. So he took two microorganisms here, two paramecia, and he put them into a tube with an oatmeal based nutrient supplement. What you see here is the growth pattern of each paramecium grown by itself. So you can see that they have very similar growth patterns when exposed to the same conditions. Here's what happens when he grows them together. At first, they both begin growing until the point when the nutrients become limiting. At first, their population is small, so the amount of nutrients available to them are large. So it's like there's no limit, right? Like I said, competition only occurs when the nutrient is limiting. So when there's only a few of these paramecia in the tube, it's like there's an abundant amount of resources. There's so many here, we don't need to compete with each other. But as their populations grow, the competition pressure becomes larger and larger and larger. And it turns out that even though they seemed really identical, they are two different species, and one of them was using the resource ever so slightly more efficiently. P. aurelia was using it a little bit more efficiently than P. caudatum, Pseudomonas caudatum. And so what we get is Gauss's concept of competitive exclusion. When two or more complete competitors coexist, two organisms that have basically the exact same niche overlap each other when they're found in the exact same location with a limiting resource, one species will inevitably drive the other one to extinction. Even if they seem perfectly identical, if they're two different species, there will be tiny little differences, and those tiny little differences will cause one of them to be driven to extinction and the other one to survive. Now that's an interesting idea, and it tells us a lot about why certain species will be driven to extinction in natural settings, but it also helps us understand some of the things that we see in nature. So here I have on this graph two different species of barnacles. We have Cthalamus and we have Balanus. And one of the interesting things about Cthalamus is that it actually can live from high tide all the way down to this line down here that says low tide. It can live in this entire intertidal zone. That's what we call its fundamental niche, all of the locations where it can survive. That's the full range of its niche. However, this Balanus, it can survive only from this low tide up to about this mark right here. That's its fundamental niche. Those are all the locations where it can survive. Balanus needs a moisture environment. So it can't survive exposed to the air for that long a period of time when you're up that high on the intertidal zone. However, in the places where Belenus can survive, it is the dominant competitor. So they utilize the same resources, the Belenus and Cathalumus. They compete for the same sorts of locations. And any place where they have niche overlap, any place where they are competitors, Belenus wins. You can see that Belenus's fundamental niche and what we call its realized niche are exactly the same. Anywhere where Belenus can live, it is the dominant species. It's the only one that's here, as a matter of fact, right? So its realized niche is where it actually lives. Its fundamental niche is where it might live. The only place available to Cathalumus, even though it could live from the top to the bottom here, is in this narrow strip where Belenus simply cannot survive. And that's its realized niche, right up here at the high mark of the intertidal zone. So Gauss's principle of competitive exclusion actually explains why these barnacles show up in two bands like this. Down here at the lower parts of the intertidal zones, they're complete competitors. And when they're complete competitors, one species completely outcompetes the other, and it is eliminated. However, up here, they're not competitors, because Belenus cannot exist up here. So Cathalumus is able to carve out a little realized niche for itself up here in the high part of the intertidal zone. And so we have a band up here and a band down here, two different species. So if at this point you're still having trouble understanding what a niche actually is, don't feel bad about that. It is a complex topic. The niche is all of the locations where an organism can exist in an ecosystem, but that is going to be determined by what types of resources it uses, right? So whether it's a predator, whether it's a producer, all of those kind of things. It's going to be determined by the physical factors that determine, whether it can survive in a given location, whether it needs lots of moisture, whether it needs salt water, whether it needs fresh water, whether it needs sunlight, all those, what kinds of temperatures it's okay with. But it also is influenced by the competitors that exist in that ecosystem. So the other organisms in the ecosystem also influence the shape of an organism's niche in that location. Now imagine a disease comes through and it wipes out Belenus, and that leaves Belenus's niche open. Well, that is bad. We're going to lose some biodiversity there. We're going to lose a little species diversity, but we have an organism that can fill in that niche immediately. Cathalumus will immediately fill in this entire intertidal zone because its fundamental niche expands all the way down here. So having a large biodiversity or a large species diversity in an ecosystem allows that ecosystem to be resilient. When you lose one species, another species can sub in. But as you continue to lose species, these niches will start to be open, and you'll start to lose ecosystem services along with it. Now, if the intensity of competition is related to how thoroughly two organisms' niches overlap each other, how many conditions they have that are similar, well, no two organisms are going to have more complete niche overlap than two members of the same species. So members of the same species are the most complete competitors with one another. A rabbit is going to compete for resources with, say, a squirrel, sure, but not nearly as much as it's competing for those resources with other rabbits in the same area. We refer to that as intra-specific competition within the same species. And it's one of the things that drives natural selection in some really interesting directions. So peacock feathers come from intraspecific competition because peacocks are constantly competing with each other for mates. Peacocks are all males. You have peacocks and peahens. So the peacocks are always looking for the most bright and colorful plumage because that will attract the females. There's no other purpose for this plumage. It's actually probably from a survival aspect a negative, right? Because it stands out to predators, and they have this big long trail of tail feathers behind them. A predator, that makes it super easy for them to catch them. All they got to do is step on the tail, and the peacock can't get away. But because these bright, colorful feathers make them more likely to reproduce than the direct competitors of their species, the other males, it's worth it to put all of this extra energy and resource into making bright, colorful feathers. Again, not a conscious decision, just something in their genes. Over here on the right, we have two male goats who are butting heads. They're doing the same thing. They're competing for mates, and as they compete, only the largest males with the biggest horns are going to be successful. So natural selection goes for larger and larger males with bigger and bigger horns over time. So both of these features, peacock feathers and goat horns, are competition-driven natural selection consequences, but not interspecific competition, intraspecific competition between members of the same species. Later we're going to talk about population ecology, and what you'll see is that as a population increases up to a certain limit, the growth of the population will actually start to slow down. And the reason is, as a population gets larger and larger, intraspecific competition will increase. As there's more members of a species, those species members will compete with each other more and more and more, because there's just more of them. And what have we been saying? Competition is a negative interaction. Negative to what? Your fitness, which is your reproductive rate. So as competition increases, as the population goes up, competition increases, reproductive rates start to drop, and the population growth will slow down. And this means that most natural populations go up to a certain amount, and then they level off. And that's what we'll call the carrying capacity of a given ecosystem. We'll come to that in one of the future slides. But again, it comes from competition, which has to do, once again, with this concept of a niche, this all-important concept in ecology, the niche.